It is your destiny, Elizabeth, to kill me.
Lord, into your hands I commend my spirit.
Mary, Queen of Scots, wasn't just killed. She was buried, dug up, moved, and sealed away in a vault no one was ever meant to see again. But after more than 200 years, that vault was forced open. The people who stepped inside expected a respectable royal tomb. Instead, they found something so grim and unexpected that even hardened historians were left speechless. The Butchered Queen. For almost 19 years, Mary, Queen of Scots, lived as a prisoner in England. She was a Catholic queen with a strong blood claim to the English throne, and that made her dangerous in the eyes of Queen Elizabeth and her advisors. That danger finally turned into a real case with what became known as the Babington Plot. In the mid-1580s, a young Catholic gentleman named Anthony Babington began sending secret letters about killing Queen Elizabeth, freeing Mary, and bringing a foreign Catholic force into England. Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, let those letters travel while his agents quietly opened, copied, and decoded every one. When Mary finally replied and seemed to approve the plan in carefully coded words, the government said they now had the proof they wanted. After that, she was tried for treason and sentenced to death. The place chosen for her execution was Fotheringhay Castle, an old stone fortress standing over the River Nene in the middle of England. On the evening before her execution, in early February of 1587, officials finally told Mary that the sentence would be carried out the next morning. She was calm. She did not scream or bargain. She spent her last hours in prayer, speaking quietly with her small household, handing out some of her personal belongings, and writing 2 final documents, a will and a long letter to the King of France, asking him to protect her servants and defend her memory. Her world that night was very small. She was not surrounded by a full court. She was allowed only a handful of close attendants. They include her steward Andrew Melville, her French physician Dominique Bourgoin, her surgeon Jacques Gervais, and her apothecary. These were men who had followed her through years of house arrest and now watched over her in the last hours. In the morning, she would ask for 2 of her ladies, including Jane Kennedy, to join her on the scaffold. While she prayed and wrote, carpenters were working in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay. They built a square wooden platform, a scaffold, and covered it in black cloth. They set up a block, a low piece of wood shaped to hold a neck, and placed a cushion beside it for her to kneel on. On the morning of the execution, Mary dressed with care. Witnesses say she came into the hall wearing a dark gown and a long black veil, holding a crucifix and a prayer book. At first, she looked like any other high-born widow in mourning. When she reached the scaffold, she was helped out of her outer garments. Underneath, she wore a bodice and sleeves of deep crimson with a matching underskirt. In Catholic tradition, red was the color of a martyr, someone who died for their faith. The men who had tried to control every detail of her death had to watch as she turned the last layer of clothing into a final defiant message. Before the blow, the 2 executioners knelt and asked for her forgiveness, as custom demanded. She said she forgave them because they were only doing their job, and she asked them to bring the stroke quickly. Then she knelt, placed her head on the block, and repeated a short prayer. What happened next shocked almost everyone in the room. The first swing of the axe missed the neck and struck the back of her head. The second blow cut deep, but did not quite sever the neck. Only after a final cut with the axe was the head fully separated from the body. Even for an age that was used to public executions, this was seen as clumsy and brutal. When the chief executioner picked up the head by the hair and cried out, "God save the Queen!" Another surprise followed. The reddish hair in his hand came away. It was a wig. Mary's head dropped to the floor, showing her real hair, short and gray after years of stress and illness. One English observer wrote that her lips still seemed to move for a short time after the beheading. Later reports also say that a small dog, which had hidden under her skirts, crawled out and lay down between her headless body and the block, refusing to move until it was dragged away. Whether every detail is exact or not, these touches made the scene feel, even to people at the time, more like the death of a saint in a story than the planned killing of a state prisoner. For Elizabeth's government, that feeling was dangerous. They were terrified that Mary's death would create a cult, a wave of devotion around her body. In Catholic countries, believers often treated objects touched by the blood of a holy person as powerful relics. To stop that from happening, the officials at Fotheringhay moved quickly. All of her clothing, the block itself, and every item stained with her blood were burned in the fireplace of the Great Hall. What could not easily be burned was thoroughly washed. Mary's body and head were taken from the scaffold and kept in a room close to the execution hall, and her loyal servants were not allowed to approach. A wooden partition was put up, but there was a small gap where some of the Scots peered through and saw the body laid out and covered with a green cloth, said to have been taken from a billiard table. Inside that private chamber, work began that would decide the condition of Mary's remains for the next months and years. Her body had to be embalmed. Embalming in that time was not a neat medical process. It meant opening the torso, removing the soft inner organs that rot quickly, draining as much fluid as possible, and packing the empty spaces with mixtures of cloth, resin, and strong-smelling spices. These spices, like cloves and myrrh, helped slow decay and cover smell. Mary's internal organs were buried secretly somewhere inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle, in an unmarked place so that no one could visit them as a shrine. Once the embalming was finished, Mary's remains were placed in a lead coffin. Lead was heavy and expensive. It also sealed tightly. That made it perfect for a royal corpse that might need to be kept for months and moved over long distances. Lead, however, does not stop decay, it only hides it. Inside a sealed metal shell, gases from the remaining tissues slowly build up. If the coffin is not made well enough, or if the soldering along the seams is weak, that pressure can force open cracks. In Mary's case, the lead coffin at Fotheringhay had started to rupture. A plumber had to be called in to mend it. All this time, Mary's request for burial was being ignored. She had asked to be buried in France, the country where she had once been queen and where she had many family ties. Elizabeth refused. Modern historians note that letting Mary's body travel to France, or even to Scotland, would have turned her grave into a powerful rallying point for Catholics who hated English rule. Instead, the English court kept her embalmed body in its lead shell at Fotheringhay for months, while they argued over how to bury her in a way that looked honorable but did not feed that kind of devotion. Meanwhile, Mary's servants remained in limbo as well. Many of them were still held at or near Fotheringhay. Her close followers sent letters to powerful men, including her son James in Scotland, asking what would happen to her body and begging for a proper burial. In the end, Elizabeth's government chose a middle path. Mary would not go to France. She would not go to Scotland. Instead, she would have a full, formal Protestant funeral in a major English cathedral not far from Fotheringhay, in a town called Peterborough. That cathedral already held the grave of another queen, Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII, so burying Mary there would look grand enough to impress foreign ambassadors. At the same time, it kept her grave under tight royal control, in a place that was important, but not as central or symbolic as the Royal Church in London. By late summer, the decision was made. The lead coffin that had sat for nearly half a year inside a guarded castle was finally brought out. The first grave. A heavy coach pulled by 4 horses carried the lead coffin along dark country roads. A royal herald told Mary's worried servants that a stone vault was ready for her inside the cathedral, and that a few of them could go with the coffin, while the rest would follow for the funeral. When the small group reached Peterborough, the coffin was carried into the bishop's palace beside the cathedral. The bishop's staff hung the great chamber with black cloth and set up a seat of state covered in purple velvet, because whatever people thought about Mary's politics or her faith, she had still been an anointed queen. Cooks and servants prepared a large funeral meal for the nobles who would attend. The funeral took place on the first day of August, a church feast day called Lammas. When the long funeral line finally set out for the cathedral, every place in it had a meaning. First came the sheriff and bailiffs of Peterborough, symbols of royal power in the town. Behind them walked a line of poor men in black gowns. Later accounts counted about 100 of these men. Their mourning clothes had been paid for by Elizabeth, and some writers said that more than 350 mourners in total received black clothing or other support from the crown. Behind the poor men came gentlemen in cloaks, chaplains, heralds, and officers of the royal household. A large banner with the arms of Scotland reminded everyone that the woman being buried had once ruled a kingdom, even though English law now said she had died a traitor. Further back in the line marched the Scots from Mary's household, still loyal in their grief, and a Scottish priest with a large cross on his chest. Near the back of the line walked the Countess of Bedford as chief mourner, her long train held up by helpers, followed by other noble ladies and Scottish gentlewomen. Behind them came more servants and poor women from the town, many of them wearing black gowns supplied at the Queen of England's expense. At the doors of Peterborough Cathedral, the clergy received the line with music. When the crowd had finally settled, the Bishop of Lincoln climbed into the pulpit and preached from the Psalms. His message was careful. He did not call Mary a martyr, and he did not praise her rule. Instead, he spoke in general terms about how short human life is and about the duty of subjects to obey their princes. He thanked God for the happy dissolution of a high and mighty princess, wording that avoided any clear judgment on whether her trial had been fair. As the formal service ended and the nobles began to leave the choir, a small quiet act showed another side of the day. The Scottish women who had stayed inside the cathedral lined up in 2 rows near the exit. As the English ladies walked past, the Scottish women reached out and kissed them. For a brief moment, the bitter political divide between the 2 camps softened into a simple show of shared loss. After that, attention turned back to the vault under the floor, where the real coffin had been placed near the high altar, opposite the grave of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. That spot tied Mary, another queen pushed aside by English power, to an older story of royal struggle. Down at the grave, the Dean of Peterborough read the final burial prayers. When the prayers were finished, the great officers of Mary's household raised their white staves of office, broke them in 2, and threw the pieces onto the coffin, a clear sign that their formal service to this queen was over. Not everyone accepted the official story presented at the funeral. A short Latin poem written by a Catholic supporter was hung near the grave, praising Mary as the true light of the age and accusing the English of cruelly destroying her. This text was quickly ordered to be taken down, most likely because it made Elizabeth look like a tyrant. Over the next years, Mary's grave at Peterborough became a quiet symbol of this struggle. On the surface, it was just one more royal burial in a well-known cathedral. But among English and Scottish Catholics, especially those living abroad, her name and story were turning into a symbol of suffering for the old faith. They wrote poems, letters, and religious works that remembered her as a victim and a witness, even though they could not openly turn her grave into a shrine. A few discreet visitors came to the cathedral, while officials stayed alert for any sign that private devotion might turn into something public and political. When Elizabeth died, Mary's son James, already king in Scotland, became King of England in the year 1603. The grave at Peterborough then became a very personal problem for the new ruler. James owed his English crown to the same bloodline that had helped destroy his mother. He had grown up under pressure not to defend her too strongly, and now he had to decide how her story would stand in his new kingdom. Soon after taking the English throne, he sent an embroidered velvet pall, a rich cloth covering, to be laid over her grave in Peterborough, a public sign that the new king honored his mother's memory. Even so, James did not at once disturb the grave. Moving the coffin too quickly might have seemed like an insult to Elizabeth's memory, or a challenge to the way her government had explained Mary's death. Leaving his mother in a small cathedral town, on the other hand, kept her under the shadow of that execution and away from the main stage of royal memory in London. For about a quarter of a century after the beheading, Mary's body stayed in that stone vault at Peterborough, under a simple marker between the high altar and the choir stalls, while visitors stepped across the place every day. Above them, the great towers of the cathedral rose into the sky, and in London, her son was quietly planning a far more dramatic change to where and how his mother would lie. The second funeral. James had grown up hearing 2 very different stories about his mother. In Scotland and in many Catholic circles in Europe, she was spoken of as a wronged queen who died for her faith. In much of Protestant England, she was remembered as a dangerous rival who had been executed for treason. As king of both kingdoms, James needed a way to calm those clashing memories and to strengthen his own position at the same time. Moving her body was his answer. By the early 1600s, he had already ordered a grand new tomb for her in the most important royal chapel at Westminster Abbey, the Lady Chapel built by King Henry VII at the far eastern end of the church. This was not just any corner of the building. It was the same chapel that held the tomb of Henry VII himself and many other kings and queens. Putting Mary there would quietly say that she belonged in the main story of English royalty, not out in a provincial cathedral. In the year 1612, James finally gave the command to lift his mother's body from her first grave and bring her to London. The body was taken out of the ground at Peterborough Cathedral and placed once again on the road, still sealed inside the heavy lead coffin. The tone of this second journey was very different from the first funeral. There was no long line of poor men in mourning clothes and no big public sermon that used her story as a warning. This time, the move was quieter and more controlled. James wanted to honor his mother, but he did not want to stir up fresh anger between Protestants and Catholics. On the 11th of October 1612, at about 6 o'clock in the evening, Mary's coffin reached Clerkenwell on the edge of London. There it was met by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Privy Seal, the Earl of Worcester, and the Dean of Westminster. From there, the group escorted the coffin into the Abbey. Inside Westminster Abbey, a new burial service was held, but again, it was nothing like a great state pageant. Mary was now being treated as the dead mother of the sitting king. If you stand in that aisle today, you see exactly what James wanted visitors to feel. On top of the tomb lies a life-sized white figure of Mary carved in marble. She is shown stretched out in full length, wearing a close-fitting head cover, a stiff, folded collar around her neck, and a long cloak fastened with a brooch across her chest. Her hands are joined in prayer. At her feet stands a crowned Scottish lion, a clear sign that her Scottish crown still matters, even though she is now in the heart of England's main royal church. Above her rises an elaborate stone canopy, once surrounded by an ornamental metal rail made by a smith named Thomas Bickford. That rail was taken away and sold off in the early 1800s, but the abbey later managed to get it back and return it to the tomb in the year 1920. The long Latin inscription on the tomb was written by Henry Howard, Earl of Northampton, one of James's leading nobles. Translated into plain English, it stresses three things over and over. First, Mary's birth. It reminds visitors that she was the daughter of King James V of Scotland and a direct descendant of King Henry VII of England through his elder daughter Margaret Tudor. Second, her roles in life. It calls her Queen of Scots by law, Queen of France by marriage, and heir to the crown of England by expectation. Third, it praises her as the mother of James, most powerful king of Great Britain. The position of the tomb inside the chapel adds another layer. Mary's monument stands in the south aisle, close to the tomb of Margaret Douglas, Countess of Lennox, who was Mary's mother-in-law, and near the grave of Margaret Beaufort, the powerful grandmother of Henry VII. On the opposite side of the chapel, in the north aisle, stands the tomb of Elizabeth I, who lies in the same vault as her half-sister Mary Tudor. So anyone walking through the Lady Chapel literally moves between two rival queens, Mary of Scots on one side and Elizabeth of England on the other. That layout was not an accident. It visually ties Mary into the main royal family line and turns the chapel into a kind of stone stage where their long rivalry continues in death. Under all that marble, hidden from the eye, sits the part that matters most, the vault. The tomb you see above ground is really just the marker. The actual body of Mary, still inside a lead coffin, was placed in a brick or stone chamber directly below the monument. The coffin was set against one wall of this chamber and became the founding burial of what later writers call the Stuart Vault in the south aisle of the Lady Chapel. Over the next century, that quiet underground room slowly filled up. James's own family and close relatives were laid there, not in separate tombs, but in the same hidden chamber. One of the earliest important burials in the vault was Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, James's eldest son. He died suddenly in the year 1612, only a short time after his grandmother's reburial. Others followed: Anne Hyde, Duchess of York, and mother of the future queens Mary II, and Anne, Elizabeth, known as the Winter Queen of Bohemia, and Prince Rupert of the Rhine, a famous royal soldier of the Civil War period. The vault also became a place of quiet tragedy. Many of the children of later Stuart kings, especially those of James II, died as babies and were laid in small coffins in the same chamber. The same thing happened with Queen Anne's children. She was James's great-granddaughter and went through at least 17 pregnancies, but not one of her children lived to adulthood. Her sons William, Duke of Gloucester, and George are buried in the Stuart Vault with her, along with two daughters named Anne Sophia and Mary. They share the space with at least 6 stillborn children and other tiny burials whose sex was never even written down. Even more closely tied to Mary's own story is another royal woman placed in this chamber, Lady Arbella Stuart, James's first cousin. She shared Mary's Tudor blood and, like Mary, was once talked about as a possible heir to the English throne. After a sad life that ended in disgrace and illness, Arbella was buried in the same underground space beneath the south aisle, with only a small plain stone between the tombs above to mark her name and year of death. For generations, that chamber stayed closed. James had moved Mary to Westminster to control how people remembered her. But when churchmen finally opened the vault, what they saw inside that crowded underground room did not fully match the calm, clean story carved in marble above. Opening the Forbidden Vault. By the 19th century, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been lying in the sealed burial vault for more than 250 years. For a long time, almost nobody went down there. The church kept careful written lists of who was buried where, but over the centuries, those lists became messy. Some burials were squeezed into old spaces, some were added in a hurry, and some coffins shifted as the floor settled. By the 1800s, a serious problem had formed. No one could say with full confidence exactly who lay in some of the royal vaults, and there were worries that parts of the building might be weakening around them. Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, decided that guesswork was no longer good enough. He was a church leader, but he also loved history and worked closely with scholars who studied the abbey. In the 1860s, he began a program of careful inspections. Stonemasons lifted slabs in the floors. Small groups of clergy and workmen climbed down into several royal vaults with lanterns. In his notes and later writings, Stanley describes opening old chambers, finding lead coffins in confusion, and trying to match bodies to the names on paper. Some of what he found shocked him. In more than one royal vault, the coffins were not neat and untouched. His records talk about split and crushed caskets, bodies shifted from their original place, and remains that were only loosely identified, if at all. As part of that same push to understand the abbey's real burial map, Stanley also had the Stuart vault under Mary's tomb opened. The door or opening to the vault was unsealed, and for the first time in many generations, light from a lantern fell on the space where Mary's actual coffin rests. Inside, the room was small and crowded. Stanley found Mary's lead coffin set against the north wall of the vault, covered in dark pitch and shaped to the form of a human body. That body-shaped form shocked him. Instead of being a simple metal box, the coffin was made like a shell that followed the outline of her shoulders, torso, and legs. That shell still held the remains that had been moved to Westminster in the early 1700s. Several other coffins crowded the vault, many of them shifted or broken so badly that their coverings no longer hid the bones inside. But Mary's own body-shaped shell remained sealed, one of the few in the chamber that time had not forced open. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.